Piercing stillness falls before the first word, as though the thought emerges from the marrow rather than the mind. Life, in its quiet cruelty, greets us with emptiness, a hollow echo in the caverns of our will. We breathe only to remember that every inhalation carries the weight of inevitable sorrow, the burden of awareness, the burden of longing, the burden of endless striving. Here, already, we stand at the edge of the abyss, and the deep truth stares back. Suffering is not an episode to be endured, but the very texture of our being. To chase the passing shapes of happiness is to dance in the periphery of a fading light. We flail toward distraction, hope, ambition, the hollow promises of modernity, with the quiet desperation of those who mistake motion for meaning. And yet, beneath each fleeting thrill, the silent ache persists. We are creatures wrenched from nothingness into consciousness, and consciousness itself is a wound, an ever-opening threshold of extinction. In this moment, when the soft veil of illusion parts, we glimpse the architecture of the world, a vast theater of desire where every actor is both playwright and prisoner. The simile of the candle applies: as long as the flame persists, shadows are cast. As long as we burn, we condemn ourselves to cast shapes that vanish in the same breath. All that we build, love, art, progress, stands upon this trembling wick. And the ground beneath shudders, a silent reminder that what we call reality is only reflection, an expanse of suffering dressed in glitter. Every culture, in its overflowing narratives, has sought to anesthetize this silent horror. We tell ourselves stories of destiny, of higher purpose, of salvation by technology, love, labor, nation, or God. The modern world, especially, boasts of liberation, freedom of choice, freedom to consume, freedom from suffering through avoidance. But freedom without suffering is smoke without fire, a vacuous spectacle. The moment we step close enough to truth, we meet suffering face to face. And when the mask slips, we see the machinery of illusions crumbling. Yet within that collapse, strange tenderness awakens, the tenderness of recognition. Suffering is not punishment, it is revelation. Each fracture in our spirit is a fissure through which light enters. Each tear in our heart is a word that speaks of our humanity. To feel this fully is to be stripped of all pretension, to descend into the self without the illusions that sway its quiet corners. We stand, naked under the pale moon of truth, and learn that what we called failure was simply life happening, as life always does, without purpose, without promise, but always with the dignity of raw presence. There is no triumphant crescendo in this realization, no final scene in which we rise on golden wings. Instead, there is a slow unclenching of the eyelids. We let the illusions fall, one by one, first the illusion of control, then the illusion of meaning, and finally the most intimate deceiver, the illusion of self as something apart from suffering and the world. And in that descent, a subtle release begins. One might mistake it for hope, but it is emptier, quieter, a grace without a name. We neither rejoice nor despair. We simply stand in the light of honesty. Because once the illusions withdraw, what remains is unadorned being, suffering, yes, but also the strange fruit of awareness that ripens on the branch of our will. We find what remains when all masks are shed, the echo of our breath, the pulse of the void, the unutterable clarity that arises in silence. No promise follows. No resolution is offered. Only the witness, the silent witness that knows the world is indifferent, and yet still watches with the fragile love of consciousness that has seen everything and says nothing. There is a final solace here, not in the promise of cure, but in the gentle surrender to what is. A surrender not born of defeat, but of recognition, that the soul can rest when its illusions are gone. And so the voice drifts, like candle smoke dissolving into the night, into nothingness. Pain is the constant thread in the fabric of consciousness, not as an anomaly, but as the very essence of life that knows itself. What we call joy is not a condition in itself, but merely the cessation of paina, momentary lifting of the veil, not into light, but into lesser shadow. To live is to strain against the bars of invisible cages, fashioned not by society or time, but by the very will that animates our breath. This will, blind and insatiable, is not ours, but is what we are, a ceaseless yearning that pulls us forward, even when we would rather be still. And so we chase after love, after success, after comfort, after immortality, in 1,000 names. But each pursuit is the echo of a hunger that cannot be satisfied, because it is not born of lack, but of existence itself. The more we possess, the more we become conscious of what we still lack. Desire, once fulfilled, does not die. It merely reshapes itself, like water poured from one vessel into another. It is the ghost that cannot be exorcised, because it is not separate from use. It is the ghost we mistake for the soul. Even our noblest aspirations are stained with this same root. Altruism, art, intellect teach becomes a mirror in which the will admires itself, disguised in finer clothes. But the hunger remains. And so we suffer, not because something has gone wrong, but because everything is precisely as it must be. This is the quiet horror of awakening, to see that the world is not a puzzle with a hidden solution, but a wheel that turns because it must. And we, bound to its spokes, mistake motion for meaning. In this light, detachment is not a virtue to be cultivated, but a realization that grows like silence in a room long abandoned. One does not renounce the world because one has conquered it, but because one has seen it clearly and found that it was never truly there. The self, that fragile architecture of thought and memory, is a shadow of the will's expression. It clings to narratives, to relationships, to identity, like a drowning man clings to driftwood. But in truth, there is nothing to hold on to. The sea stretches in all directions, vast and indifferent, and what we fear is not drowning, but the realization that we were never separate from the water to begin with. The religions of old whispered of this, though few truly heard. Not the salvation promised in ecstatic rapture, but the cessation of becoming the stillness of non-willing, where the wheel no longer finds a place to turn. It is not annihilation, but the end of illusion. And that, in the end, is the only liberation that does not enslave. Yet we do not speak of these things. Society, with its shallow mirrors, fears such reflections. It paints over them with noise, with commerce, with perpetual distraction. And so we remain, each of us, a silent scream beneath the mask of composure. We ask, endlessly, what the meaning of life might be, but only because we are terrified of the answer. That meaning is not given, not found, not earned. Meaning is constructed, and therefore always crumbling. It is scaffolding built upon sand. And yet, within this crumbling, something serene begins to breathe. The detachment that follows such disillusionment is not apathy, but lucidity. One no longer needs to believe, to strive, to possess. One simply sees. And in that seeing, a new kind of tenderness arises not toward life, but toward those who suffer within it. For we are all passengers in the same vessel, drifting on a sea without map or shore, each pretending, for the sake of the other, that we know where we are going. But we do not. And in that shared ignorance, perhaps, lies the closest thing to communion. Every heartbeat is a drumbeat in the procession of decay. The body, that ephemeral garment of the will, carries within it the quiet ticking of time, each cell a clock wound toward its own undoing. And yet we cling to it, not out of love, but out of terror. The terror of the void, the unformed silence that stretches before birth and after death. We imagine ourselves as centers of meaning, yet in the still moments when the music stops, when the distractions falter, what returns is not clarity, but the oppressive weight of being without why. Even our tears betray us. They fall not only from pain, but from the unbearable beauty of things we know we must lose. A face glimpsed in fading light, a voice trembling with the ache of goodbye, a moment so fragile it seems the very air might shatter it. These are not gifts, but glimpseless openings through which the infinite indifference peers, and we, for a moment, become conscious of our fragility. And in that consciousness, we suffer twice, once for the loss itself, and once for the knowledge that we were never meant to hold it. The world, in its dazzling complexity, is not a sanctuary but a snare. Nature, red in tooth and claw, does not comfort, it consumes. The blossom that enchants us blooms only to wither. The sunrise that paints the sky in golden hues merely announces the rotation of a sphere destined for entropy. And yet we romanticize this world, not because it deserves romance, but because we are desperate to find reflections of ourselves in it. We whisper meaning into the void, as a child whispers secrets to a doll, pretending it listens. Love so often idolized as transcendencies, in truth another expression of the will's trap. We do not fall in love with others, but with the illusions they allow us to hold. We desire not the person, but the version of ourselves they reflect. And when that mirror cracks, when the fantasy dissolves under the pressure of reality, we call it heartbreak. But what breaks is not the heart. It is the illusion of permanence, of unity, of salvation through another. The same will that drew us toward them now drags us back into the abyss, reminding us that no connection can ever truly free us from ourselves. Art, too, becomes a cry in this wilderness, a beautiful cry, perhaps, but a cry nonetheless. We create not to celebrate life, but to endure it. The painter, the composer, the poet all speak the language of those who have seen too much. Their works shimmer not with joy, but with the sorrow of having touched the void and survived. Each brushstroke, each note, each word is a wound made visible, a testimony to the fact that something within us still seeks to express the inexpressible. And yet, for all our efforts, silence remains the final answer. The universe does not speak. It neither judges nor redeems. It turns endlessly, as it always has, as it always will. Stars are born and die in the cold theater of space. Entire civilizations rise and fall without leaving a trace in the cosmos. And we, tiny sparks on this indifferent stage, continue to ask questions that have no answers. We search for justice, for meaning, for patterns in chaos. But all we find are echoes, reflections of our own longing, not truths. To live without illusion is to live without a future. The future, after all, is the greatest illusion of all. The promise that things will improve, that suffering will diminish, that peace lies just beyond the horizon. But the horizon recedes with every step. The will drives us forward, but there is no destination, only movement. Like Sisyphus, we roll the stone not because we believe it will stay, but because we are bound to do so. Detachment, then, is not chosen, it is recognized. It emerges when the fever of the will begins to subside, when one no longer expects joy from the world, nor seeks to extract fulfillment from it. It is the quiet step back, the gaze turned inward, the relinquishing of desire not from disdain, but from understanding. One sees clearly that everything striven for is already in the process of dissolution. One loves still, but without clinging. One acts still, but without belief in lasting impact. This is the sobriety of the soul, not numbness, but lucidity. It is not the absence of feeling, but the presence of a feeling that no longer deceives. A tenderness unmoored from hope. A grief that no longer pleads for redemption. It is not enlightenment, for that suggests elevation. It is descent into the marrow, into the void, into the truth that has no form. And in that descent, we do not find peace, but we find something more enduring, the cessation of pretending. The will fades, the illusions fall away. What remains is not emptiness, but a stillness beyond desire, a stillness that needs no audience, no validation, no purpose. Only the breath, the moment, the flickering awareness that asks nothing, that holds nothing, that simply is, and then even that dissolves. In the end, all effort returns to the silence from which it came. The hand that builds, the voice that sings, the heart that yearns all are pulled back into the great unraveling. There is no permanence to anchor ourselves upon, no island in the sea of flux. What we call self is merely the momentary arrangement of countless currents, each shaped by forces that remain unseen, uncaring. And as the currents shift, so too does the self dissolve, not with violence, but with the quiet inevitability of water losing its shape. Suffering does not shout. It lingers beneath the surface, in the spaces between words, in the pauses between gestures. It is not always pain that wounds the deepest, but the absence of what one cannot name. A void not filled by anything external, for nothing external was ever missing. The ache lies in the realization that there is no object that can silence it, no fulfillment that can complete it. The will longs only because it must, not because there is anything worth longing for. To strip away illusion is not an act of courage, but an unfolding. Like petals falling from a dying flower, the veils drop not from force, but from time. Illusion is not an enemy to be fought, but a phase to be passed through, an essential mist that guards the young soul from the coldness of clarity. But when the eyes adjust to the dimmer light, when the colors fade and the shapes harden into truth, then one begins to see the world as it is, not cruel, not kind, but unshaped by intention. We speak often of hope as if it were salvation, but hope is only another mask. It dangles the possibility of escape just far enough to keep the will in motion. It seduces with promises it cannot fulfill, and each time it is betrayed, we mourn not the loss of what was hoped for, but the collapse of the illusion that gave us direction. And still, we hope again, because the will knows no rest. Even in despair it stirs. Modernity, with its bright lights and relentless motion, excels at distracting the will. It packages suffering in palatable doses and sells comfort as a substitute for truth. But the truth remains beneath it all, untouched by progress or technology. No device, No ideology, no achievement can erase the fundamental anguish of being. The loneliness, the uncertainty, the ever-present pull of death, they remain, whispered into our ears by each passing moment, no matter how loud the world becomes. Detachment is not a shield. It does not protect from sorrow or numb the pain. It merely accepts them, welcomes them as parts of the same unfolding. The detached one does not rise above the world, but sinks more deeply into its seas, its patterns, its repetitions, its futility. And in that depth, a strange compassion is born. Not the compassion that seeks to save, but the one that understands there is nothing to be saved, only witnessed. Even beauty becomes a quiet ache. For beauty is never pureate, is always laced with the knowledge of its own decay. The most exquisite music fades into silence. The most tender gaze closes with sleep. The most vivid memory turns to ash under the weight of time. We are haunted not by ugliness, but by how quickly beauty dies, and how often we forget that it ever lived. Thus, detachment is not an escape from feeling, but a refinement of it. One feels more, not less, but no longer clings, no longer grasps. One begins to watch, to observe, to trace the outlines of experience without attempting to hold it in place. One learns to weep without protest, to love without demand, to vanish without resistance. The self begins to vanish, not in destruction, but in quiet dissolution. What we thought was I turns out to be a mask worn by the will, an actor in a play without script or audience. And as the mask is removed, what remains is not a new identity, but the absence of identity. Not enlightenment, but cessation. And this, too, is suffering. To know that even our deepest truths are impermanent, that the insight which soothes today may mean nothing tomorrow. But within that, there is a grace more enduring than certainty, grace born of ceasing to pretend. We no longer lie to ourselves about the nature of the world. We no longer seek to bend it to our will. We let it be what it is. And in that letting go, there is peace, not joyful, not triumphant, but still. Still as the surface of a dark lake untouched by wind. The candle burns lower. The shadows lengthen. There is no ending, no revelation, only the slow undoing of illusion. And in that undoing, the soul finds its final gesture. Not a cry, not a plea, but a silence that no longer asks for anything. The tragedy of life is not its brevity, but its persistence. Each morning we awaken to the same weight, the same cycle, the same burden of continuity. To exist is to be condemned to repetition, to reenact the same desires, suffer the same losses, rehearse the same delusions under the illusion of novelty. The days pass not as a river flows, but as wheels turning on the same axis. Every pleasure gained is already dying at the moment it touches the senses, and every sorrow carries the echo of sorrows past. There is nothing new beneath this sun, only old wounds wearing new masks. Time does not heal, it erodes. It wears down the edges until what was once unbearable becomes a quiet ache folded into the fabric of the soul. We mistake this erosion for healing because we forget the sharpness of the original pain. But the truth is that suffering does not vanish, it becomes us. It settles into the bones, into the gaze, into the way we pause before speaking. It lives on in silence, in hesitation, in dreams that end in falling. This is the human condition, to carry within us the inescapable contradiction of desire and decay. We want what we cannot keep. We keep what we no longer want. And through it all, the will drives us blind, relentless, without aim or conscience. We imagine ourselves as free, as rational, as moral beings, yet our actions betray the same ancient hunger. Whether in lust or ambition, in love or cruelty, we are but instruments of the will's single command. Continue. Freedom is not the ability to choose, but the ability to stop choosing, to cease, to say no not to others, but to the self that wants. But who among us has ever truly stopped? Even in resignation, there is often a hidden will to be seen as wise, to appear detached, to attain the quiet superiority of the one who does not care. But true detachment is invisible. It makes no claims. It asks for no witness. It is the end of pretending, not the beginning of a new performance. And so the world continues, not as a drama, but as a recurrence. Birth follows death, love follows loss, hope follows despair, each feeding the next, like fire feeding smoke. We are born into this wheel not because we were chosen, but because there was no choosing. Consciousness dawns upon us without our consent, and from that moment onward we are caught. To live is to be caught, to be conscious is to suffer. Religion, poetry, art, philosophy, they are the shadows cast by our effort to make this bearable. They offer structure, symbolism, ritual small sanctuaries against the storm of meaninglessness. But none of them can hold back the truth when it finally arrives, when it seeps through the cracks in our stories. That truth is not cruel, only cold. It simply says, you are here, without reason. And soon, you will not be. Some call this nihilism, as if to name it were to defeat it. But nihilism is not a belief, it is the falling away of belief. It is what remains when the scaffolding of illusion has collapsed, and no new edifice rises to replace it. It is not despair, for despair implies the hope that has been crushed. It is the absence of that hope, altogether the stillness that comes when the storm has passed, and left nothing standing. And in this stillness, a strange clarity emerges. Not meaning, but awareness. Not peace, but absence of disturbance. The self, no longer inflated by its illusions, begins to feel like a shadow walking beside the body. There is no longer a need to assert, to strive, to become. One simply exists, without anchor, without purpose, like a leaf drifting in dark water. Detachment, at last, is the soul's surrender to gravity, no longer trying to rise, no longer trying to fly. It does not grieve its fall, nor does it celebrate it. It simply allows itself to descend, deeper into what is, not as an act of courage or rebellion, but as the only honest movement left. And the descent continues, through memory, through grief, through silence, until even silence becomes too loud, and what remains is a kind of vanishing not, a disappearance of the body, but of the need to be anything at all. The will flickers, the self grows dim, and what once was a burning question dissolves into the vast, indifferent night. No revelation comes, no light breaks the sky, only the recognition that none is needed. The world does not owe us meaning, nor does it withhold it. It simply is. And when we can finally look upon it without asking, without grasping, without naming, then perhaps, we have touched something that lies beyond the will. Something quieter than truth. Something that no longer speaks. The sky, in its endless silence, does not comfort. It watches, impassive, as our lives unfold in their familiar tragedy. Beneath its vast indifference, we cling to our stories not because they are true, but because they are needed. The story of progress, the story of love, the story of permanence, a thin veil stretched across the face of chaos. Without these fictions, we would see too clearly, and seeing clearly, we would fall. To see without illusion is not enlightenment, but exposure. One stands naked before existence, stripped of hope, stripped of identity, unable to plead for meaning. And in that exposure, the heart does not expand, it contracts. It recoils from the coldness of a universe that gives nothing and takes everything. And yet, even in this recoil, there is a kind of beauty, the beauty of something that endures, not out of strength, but out of surrender. We imagine life as a path, a forward motion, a rising arc, but it is a circle. We do not advance, we return. The same hunger, the same fears, the same small joys, endlessly revisited under new disguises. The years do not take us forward, but inward into the labyrinth of our own compulsions. And at the center of that labyrinth, there is no revelation, only a mirror. And in that mirror, the face of the will, endlessly reshaping itself to survive its own emptiness. The will does not love us. It drives us. It uses our suffering as fuel, our dreams as bait. It is not evil, because it is not moral. It is not conscious, because it has no need to be. It moves through us like fire through dry grass without hesitation, without regret. And we, mistaking its movement for purpose, believe we are meant for something. But we are not meant for anything. We are here because the wheel turns, and it turns because it cannot stop. Even the moments we treasure, those rare instants of connection, of silence, of what we call happiness, are already fading the moment we notice them. They are not oases, but mirages. The reflection of something we wish were there, something we know cannot last. The kiss, the embrace, the sunset all pass through us, like light through glass. They leave an impression, a warmth, but they do not stay. They cannot stay. Nothing can. So we grieve, constantly and often unconsciously. We grieve the loss of what we never truly had, the future that never arrives, the self that never becomes. We mourn not just death, but life itself, the way it deceives us, the way it unfolds with such precision and yet refuses to justify its own existence. There is no moral arc, no final harmony. There is only the unfolding, and then the end. And yet, we continue, not because we believe, but because belief is no longer required. The machine moves with or without our consent. We continue because the will continues through us, like wind through a hollow reed. Our desires may change shape, our identities may fracture and reform, but the motion remains. And to resist it is not bravery, but futility. The only freedom lies not in rebellion, but in release. Release is not dramatic. It does not arrive with thunder or triumph. It is a gradual softening, a loosening of the grip, a turning away from the clamor. One no longer argues with fate, no longer begs the world to explain itself. One simply lives quietly, soberly, without anticipation. The taste of food, the sound of rain, the touch of a passing wind, these become enough, not because they fulfill us, but because we have ceased demanding that they do. This is not contentment, it is resignation, a peaceful acceptance of the world's indifference, and of our own transience within it. We do not need to be more than we are, we do not need to matter. We are here for a time, like shadows cast by flame, and then we are gone, and the flame, too, will die. In the end, there is only this moment unadorned, unpromising, uncaring. And in this moment, if we can cease our hunger, cease our striving, cease our asking, then we may find something quieter than peace. Not the absence of pain, but the absence of resistance to it. Not the erasure of the self, but the gentle recognition that the self was never solid to begin with. And in that recognition, even suffering becomes less sharp. It no longer pierces, but passes through. For what is there to wound, when one no longer clings to being whole? What is there to fear, when one no longer insists on permanence? The wheel turns, the candle burns, the night deepens, and somewhere, beneath the noise, the soul sits in silence, no longer seeking, no longer naming, no longer asking, simply watching, simply being, and, at last, simply fading. What remains, when all has been relinquished, is not void, but stillness, a silence so deep it does not even echo. The will, once a fever in the blood, lies dormant now like ash after fire, like breath that no longer stirs the chest. One does not miss it, for in its absence there is no hunger, and where there is no hunger, there is no self to be denied. The world, once so sharp with demand and promise, softens into a quiet apparition, unmoved, unthreatening, no longer a mirror of our torment. The hands no longer reach, the eyes no longer search. Even thought becomes a river flowing without direction, carrying the remnants of memory and meaning to some ocean where distinction ceases. One watches the days not with dread or anticipation, but as one watches leaves fall in a forest where no one walks. There is no loneliness here, because there is no longer a self to be alone. There is only the quiet unfolding of what is, stripped of purpose, free of need. It is here, at the end of striving, that life finally shows its Fasano as enemy or savior, but as it truly is, indifferent, transient, and strangely gentle. It asks nothing of us. It does not care whether we succeed or fail, whether we speak or fall silent. The sun will rise whether or not we look up. The earth will turn whether or not we step forward. The stars will burn out whether or not we remember their names. To accept this is not to be broken, but to be unburdened. It is not to sink in despair, but to float in stillness. There is no redemption because there was no fall. There is no final answer because there was no question. All things are as they must be, not good, not evil, not just, but necessary, without justification. The rain falls on all, and no sky explains itself. Even love, when it no longer clings, becomes something holy, not because it endures, but because it does not try to. It moves like music through a room, echoing briefly in the hollow of the chest, then vanishing without regret. What once we feared to lose, we now watch pass with calm eyes. What once we clutched to our breast, we now lay gently on the altar of transience. And thus the self recedes, not in defeat, but in fulfillment of its own disappearance. It came from nothing, it returns to nothing, and in between it dreamed itself into being. All that it called mine was borrowed from a world that never promised it permanence. And now, without bitterness, it gives it all back. There is no death here, only dissolution. No ending, only the falling away of names. One does not die with a cry, but with a whisper, a soft exhale that carries away the last illusion, leaving behind not darkness, but the absence of the need for light. The candle dims, the final shape dissolves. There is no audience left to witness the vanishing, and none is needed. What remains is the stillness that was always there. Waiting, watching, wanting nothing,